Hello, my name is Professor John Dewar, and I am the Vice-Chancellor of La Trobe University. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the fact that tonight's event and our participants are located on the lands of traditional custodians throughout Victoria and other parts of Australia. I pay my respects to Indigenous elders, past and present, and extend this respect to Indigenous participants who are joining us online. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to the first event in this year's Ideas in Society series. Emeritus Professor Robert Mann, AO, a La Trobe University Vice-Chancellor's Fellow and convener of the Ideas in Society programme, is curating the series for a 14th year in 2023. Ideas in Society brings together some of the nation's most respected thinkers and experts to talk about the big issues facing our region and the world. These discussions are important because Ideas in Society provides a platform for much more detailed, nuanced, and sophisticated analysis of issues than the mainstream media. I'm sure that tonight's event, How to Defend Australia, Some Alternative Visions, will be no exception. Australia's location in Oceania between the Indian and Pacific Oceans means that we cannot ignore the forces at play in our region. On the one hand, there's China's rise as a global economic and military power. On the other, we're caught up in the deterioration of diplomatic relations between China and the United States. What does this mean for Australia's sovereignty and for the defence of our shores? And what does our response to China mean for our relationship with the United States? In other words, what is the policy dynamic between Washington, Beijing, and Canberra? The Albanese government's defence strategy is following that of its predecessor. Our ties to the US and to our other long-standing ally, the United Kingdom, are formalised in the AUKUS agreement. But what are the pitfalls of binding our defence relations to the US and UK in this way, and what are the alternatives? Well, we have three people joining us tonight who are eminently qualified to talk about what's at stake and how the nation can respond. And it's my great pleasure to introduce them now. Dr. Rebecca Strating is Director of La Trobe Asia and an Associate Professor in Politics and International Relations at La Trobe University. Beck is a recognised authority on the international politics of maritime disputes in Asia and Australian foreign policy. In 2018, she was awarded the prestigious Boyer Prize by the Australian Institute of International Affairs, and in 2019 was an Asian Studies Visiting Fellow at the East-West Centre in Washington, D.C. Beck is currently working on a book with Joanne Wallace called Girt by Sea, Reimagining Australia's Security, which will be published by La Trobe University Press next year. Emeritus Professor Hugh White, AO, has worked on Australian defence and foreign policy issues since 1980. In the 1990s, he served as International Relations Advisor to Prime Minister Bob Hawke and as Deputy Secretary for Strategy and Intelligence in the Department of Defence. He was the principal author of Australia's Defence White Paper, published in 2000, and was made an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2014 for distinguished service to international affairs and to public administration. Hugh is the author of several important books, including How to Defend Australia, which was published by La Trobe University Press in 2019. Hugh's currently working on a book on Asia's new geopolitics that will also be published by La Trobe University Press. Sam Roggeveen is Director of the Lowy Institute's International Security Programme. Previously, he was a Senior Strategic Analyst with the Office of National Assessments and worked in the Department of Foreign Affairs and as an analyst in the Defence Intelligence Organisation. Sam writes for newspapers and magazines and is a regular commentator on the Lowy Institute's digital magazine, The Interpreter, of which he was the founding editor. Sam's book, The Echidna Strategy, Australia's Search for Power and Peace, will be published in August by, you've guessed it, La Trobe University Press. We're really pleased that all of tonight's speakers are so strongly connected to La Trobe and to our university press, run in partnership with Black Ink. and also happen to be three of the foremost experts on Australia's defence policy. So Beck will now lead the discussion, and it's my great pleasure to hand over to her to get things underway. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor. Hello and welcome to our audience, and welcome also to Hugh and Sam. It's great to be sharing a panel with you once again as we discuss these very important issues. And I thought that we should begin by discussing last week's AUKUS announcement. So for those of you who might not be familiar, the governments of Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States announced their plans for Australia to acquire nuclear-powered submarines as part of Pillar 1 of the AUKUS agreement that was announced in September 2021. This was the so-called optimal pathway that the governments had promised, and it basically has three key stages. The first stage involves Australian military and civilian personnel embedding with the United States and the United Kingdom navies, as well as an increase in US port visits in Australia, as well as US and UK submarine rotations through Australia's Stirling base from 2027. The second key phase involves the sale of US Virginia-class submarines, at least 3 submarines, but potentially 5, with the first being delivered from 2033. The third stage involves the creation of a new class of submarine, the SSN-AUKUS, combining UK design with US technology, intended to be purchased by both the United Kingdom and Australia. The UK will get theirs, according to this timeline, late 2030, whereas Australia will get theirs early 2040s. So the proposal, we are told, will cost up to $368 billion, which seems like a staggering amount of money. What we want these submarines to do, however, seems to be a more difficult question to answer. And there have been a number of different justifications that have been offered. It's been said that they will contribute to integrated deterrence. The aim is to deter adversaries from changing the status quo, particularly in East Asia. And so this will be part of a US-led collective effort. It's also been said that these nuclear-powered submarines will contribute to enhancing regional stability and security. They may also enable Australian governments to adopt a porcupine strategy, or as Sam might say, an echidna strategy. So these submarines could contribute to deterring attacks on Australian territory. There's also been the suggestion that they will assist in preventing shipping blockades. So there's a range of justifications, but I think the question here is whether or not they add up to a coherent strategy, whether we actually have a clear sense of what the Australian government wants to do with these nuclear-powered submarines as part of a broader strategy. So Sam, I'm going to start with you. Given that you've been writing a book proposing an echidna strategy for Australia, why do you see Australia investing so much in nuclear-powered submarines? What is the underlying strategy? Having trouble hearing Sam, so maybe Hugh, would you mind, just while we resolve some of these technology issues, I was going to ask you anyway, what you consider to be is there an underlying strategy, or is it just this sort of basket of justifications going on here?
Well, look, really good question to start with, Beck, and can I say what a pleasure it is to be here with you and with Sam to take part in this program. Look, I think one of the problems we have in this is that the justifications, the rationales are not very clear, and that's partly because I don't think we have a very clear understanding of exactly what kind of threat we're facing I do, and what exactly our strategic objective is. I think in the government's own mind, there are more or less two separate kind of things going on. On the one hand, I think the government wants, and you touched on this in your intro, the government wants to preserve the status quo in East Asia, the US-led order in East Asia, and it wants to deter China or support America in deterring China from challenging that. And the rationale, and that aspect of the rationale is that we want to provide forces which can underpin America's position in the Western Pacific and strengthen American deterrence of China as China tries to challenge that US-led order, or what Australian governments call the rules-based order. So that's one rationale for buying these submarines. And one can evaluate whether it's a good idea or not on the basis of whether it supports that rationale. The other rationale, and you also touched on this, is that the government wants to enhance Australia's capacity to defend Australia independently. And we can also assess the wisdom of the AUKUS program as a way of doing that task. As it happens, I don't think, in relation to either of those sets of objectives, I don't think AUKUS is a very cost-effective way of achieving our objectives. But one of the reasons why it can be a very complex debate is that it's so easy to get muddled between the two of them.
Well, that's a really helpful sort of place to ask Sam about the effectiveness, or whether or not the nuclear-powered submarines will help with an echidna strategy. I mean, it would be good to hear your view on what an echidna strategy actually is. And it seems from my reading of things, the emphasis has been really on these submarines operating in waters not close to Australia's shores. I mean, the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, has talked about a porcupine strategy in relation to the submarines. But what's your reading on this?
Well, thanks, Beck, and it's great to be part of this. Can I just briefly thank Vice-Chancellor Dewar and Rob Mann as well for making this possible. This is it's wonderful to be part of it. Look, certainly the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, has something different in mind when he refers to a porcupine strategy than I do when I refer to an echidna strategy, and I'll come to that in just a moment. The way to work my way towards that answer is just to briefly lay out what I think the nuclear-powered submarines might be for. And we can only infer because the government itself hasn't really said very much about this. In fact, ever since AUKUS was first announced by the Morrison government in September of 2021, I mean, it's notable that between the date of that announcement and then the 18 months later cut to Prime Minister Albanese in San Diego, there was an information vacuum from the government. There was not a single prime ministerial statement. Neither side's defence minister, whether that was the Morrison government or the Albanese government, made a statement to Parliament. Nobody gave a major speech. Quite scandalous, really, I think, for an initiative of this magnitude and of this ambition for the public to know so little about it. So we can only infer what in fact the government has in mind for the role of these submarines. So how do we infer? Well, one way we do that is by examining what nuclear-powered submarines are actually really good for. And what nuclear-powered submarines in particular have to their advantage is endurance and range, which is to say they can stay underwater for a long time, actually months at a time, really only restricted by the endurance of the crew, and whether there's enough food on board, and whether the morale of the crew can actually be maintained after months underwater. And they can travel much further and much faster than diesel electric submarines. So, for instance, I saw a study recently from a US think tank which estimated that for an Australian submarine operating in the South China Sea, the transit time for a nuclear-powered submarine would be roughly a third of as for a diesel boat, and they could stay on station for something like 70 or 80 days, whereas an equivalent diesel boat could stay on station for maybe 11 or 12 days. So it really is a very big difference and a very big capability leap in that respect. So that in itself gives you a hint of what these submarines are for. We want long endurance and we want long range. The other hint that you get from the submarines themselves is that they're going to carry long range missiles that are designed to hit land targets, Tomahawk cruise missiles. So again, that gives us a clue about what we want to do. We want to operate well to our north, and we want to be able to fire missiles at the landmass of an adversary, which obviously, to my mind and to everyone's mind, is China, although the government refuses to actually acknowledge that fact for understandable reasons. The other reasons we know that, or we can guess that this is the strategy, is because sotto voce, the various people have been saying this from inside government. So Richard Marles, the Defence Minister, talks about impactful projection, which carries an implication of long-range operations. Under the last government, we had the Australian ambassador to the United States, Arthur Sinodinos. I don't have the actual words of the quote on me. It's going to be in my book. But he talks about being able to operate well to Australia's north. And if the viewers go back to Peter Harcher's series that he wrote on, which is probably still the most definitive account of how AUKUS actually came together, it is clear he has direct quotes from the people closest to this. The plan is to operate well to our north and effectively to be able to participate in operations that hem the Chinese Navy in close to its shores, to sink Chinese ships close to their shores, and to fire missiles onto the Chinese mainland. The mystery, of course, is why we would want to do this, because to my mind at least, and this is where we come to the echidna strategy, Australia's single biggest defence asset is distance. We are very far away from any country, particularly China, that wants to cause us trouble. Beijing is closer to London than it is to Sydney. And yet we seem to be building now a force structure which is designed to compress that distance, when what we ought to be doing is exploiting that distance. And that would, I think, mean we would operate much closer to Australia's shores. If we want to defend the Australian landmass and Australia's interests, I think we should do it in the air and sea approaches to Australia, rather than handing the advantage of distance to a potential adversary. I'll leave it there.
Well, we might get back to that question about what alternatives might exist if it was, if Australia was really to sort of build a genuine echidna strategy. What would the alternatives to nuclear-powered submarines be? Because one of the justifications also is this idea of regional superiority, that nuclear-powered submarines are a superior submarine to conventionally powered submarines. But I did want to go to this question of sovereignty, because that seems to be one that has emerged over the last couple of weeks in the discussions around AUKUS, is whether or not these nuclear-powered submarines will be sovereign capabilities, so whether or not they will be controlled and commanded by Australians, but also this much broader question about what this means for Australia's sovereignty and its agency in making decisions down the track. So one thing to note here from my view is that the idea of sort of state sovereignty is, as being absolute or exclusive is a bit of a myth. I mean, states enter into international agreements all the time and they present limits on what states can do or how they can act because they might see this as ultimately producing a better outcome in the long run. For example, trying to produce regional security or stability. But there is this question, AUKUS, we can say, is an act of sovereign decision-making, but the question is, how is this then likely to constrain Australia's strategic options down the line? So will ultimately this be a decision that entraps Australian decision makers in some way? There is already a fair degree of interoperability between Australian and US defence capabilities as a result of a series of historical decisions, of which AUKUS is one. So Sam, I might go back to you on this question about submarines, being sovereign capabilities, and if they aren't, why does this matter? But also, how is, if the command is under Australian sovereignty, as politicians are promising us that they are, how does this then become an issue for Australian sovereignty?
Thank you. Well, I noticed that the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, on the weekend responded to those arguments about sovereignty in a slightly dismissive way, and said that Australia unequivocally maintains, freedom of decision making on whether it will join a US war against China, whether that be over Taiwan or anything else. Now, I think on the merits, at a superficial level, he's absolutely right. I don't at all think that he's being disingenuous on that point. I'm sure he's correct, but it also somewhat misses the point. There are really two things to be said about sovereignty. One, the first one is the point that Malcolm Turnbull, the former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, and also former Prime Minister Paul Keating have made, is that because we don't have any real experience operating nuclear reactors, therefore our sovereignty is compromised, because we will have to rely so much on American and to a lesser extent British help just to operate these submarines, and therefore it won't be purely for us to make decisions about how they are operated. Now, critics will point out, well, yes, that's a problem with all our weapons purchases. I mean, we don't build our own fighter jets, for instance. We rely on American technology to help us keep those operational and keep those in fighting shape. And to a degree, that's a reasonable point, but it is a question of degree. And so I think the Turnbull-Keating argument has merit to the extent that this is simply on another level of dependency, particularly in the early years when we simply have no experience and we've built very little expertise through our universities and through our military to operate these submarines independently. But I also think, and this brings me to the second point, that actually that's not even the main concern about sovereignty and autonomy of decision making. The main concern is really that I think we tend to have this idea in defence policy that there's a very neat policy process. We decide what equipment, we do a very rational policy process where we come to decisions, we write reports and come to decisions about the kind of equipment we need for the strategy that we have, and then we buy that equipment, and then the equipment implements the strategy. But actually, it can work the other way around. So military capabilities can actually drive policy. What you have determines, to some degree, what you do. And so in this context, simply having these nuclear-powered submarines will drive policy. So even if there's never a formal agreement tying us to American policy on Taiwan, for instance, the very fact that we have a submarine fleet like this, which is going to be designed for the next 3 decades to fit in to an American centered strategy of containing Chinese ambitions on Taiwan. On the day that the balloon goes up, we can't very well at that point say, no, I'm sorry, we're backing off. Having built this capability alongside the United States for 3 decades, it will be almost impossible at that point to say no. So I think that is the real sovereignty concern, that is that capability will drive our policy.
I think there's a level of sort of technological determinism in that I'm not quite sure I'm comfortable with. I mean, it risks underplaying Australian agency. It risks underplaying the role of Australian decision makers for the next 3 decades, I guess, in trying to ensure that Australia maintains its independence within an alliance context, because in some ways these issues are enduring issues about Australia's ability to maintain strategic options given its relationship with the United States. But Hugh, I'd like to get your view in on this. I think you've been quite clear about that Australia's agency is likely to be constrained. Could Australia maintain its strategic autonomy while continuing to deepen these defence partnerships, or are you sceptical about that?
Well, Beck, the first point to make is I'd very much agree with the structure that Sam put around this issue. I'd also very much agree with the point you made earlier, and that is that sovereignty is a very blunt conceptual instrument to use, at least particularly the way sovereignty is talked about by politicians, as if it's, you've either got it or you haven't. No, the way in which countries, compromise their or adjust their decision-making positions in order to maximise their outcomes, just as humans do all the time. I mean, we cooperate and we close off options for ourselves just because that's the best way of getting where we want to go. So it's a much more complicated thing than that. I mean, I agree with Sam. I think the point that Richard Marles made on the Insiders program on Sunday, when he said that these submarines will be commanded by Australians and therefore, I'm paraphrasing, the Americans can't send them off to war without our permission. I think that's probably right. But I think it misses an important point, and that is that for as long as we require American, or for that matter, British help to actually operate the submarines day to day, they will have a veto on what we do. Because if they withdraw their personnel, then our submarines can't operate. So that is a situation in which our operational autonomy will be compromised. It's also true that because we import a lot of military technology, because we do depend on other countries. For example, I think Sam mentioned the example of the F-35s, fighter aircraft, very complicated system. We depend on the United States for supporting those. But one of the aims of good defence policy should be to acknowledge that we do. It's reasonable for us to accept some of that dependency in order to get access to better technology, but at the same time to minimise it as much as possible. And what strikes me as one of the arguments against AUKUS, against the idea of acquiring nuclear-powered versus conventionally powered submarines, is that the loss of operational autonomy, the extent to which we depend on other countries to run these, to help us make these systems work and take them to war, is much higher is going to be much higher in the case of nuclear-powered submarines than it will be in the case of conventionally powered submarines. And so that's one of the things we have to weigh against the operational advantages of nuclear-powered submarines, is the disadvantages that go with them. And we might get back to discuss that later, but this would be one of the factors that would be in the balance. But the other point, again, touching on Sam's point, that I think to understand the way in which pursuing a nuclear-powered submarine capability in the way we are shapes our future strategic options, is to ask ourselves, what's America looking for in this? Why has America done this deal? And I think the answer to that is absolutely unambiguous. America is helping Australia acquire nuclear-powered submarines and will, in phase 2, as you spelled it out, actually pass some of their nuclear-powered submarines to us. And it's worth making the point here, the submarines, the Virginia-class submarines will be passed to Australia in phase 2, will come out of the US Navy's order of battle. No one is saying they're going to build extra Virginia-classes for Australia. We are going to take submarines away from the US Navy. So why would the Americans do that? It's only conceivable that they do that if they were absolutely sure that if they find themselves at a war with China over Taiwan or anything else, those submarines will be available to them. So I think the real key to understanding this is to say that that AUKUS commits Australia to support the United States in a war with China, because the deal will be off if we don't. If the balloon goes up, and an Australian Prime Minister says, when Joe Biden or his successor rings us up and says, we're going to war over Taiwan, will you join in? And an Australian Prime Minister says no, then one of the many things that the American Prime Minister would say back is, well, that's the end of AUKUS. And yet again, we're back to square one on how we buy a new submarine.
I'm curious, though, just to jump in there, Hugh, about whether or not Australia was already, you mentioned Taiwan, was already committed anyway. What's your, does this just, further that commitment? Is there something substantially different that AUKUS does? Because, we have the former Defence Minister, Peter Dutton, came out and said it was inconceivable that Australia wouldn't get involved in Taiwan. And he seems right about that, even though he was saying the quiet bit out loud. But isn't Australia kind of already all the way with the US on some of these issues anyway?
Well, I think in the minds of many of us, certainly in the minds of Peter Dutton, but I suspect also in the minds of his Labor successors, and I think also in the minds of the vast majority of people in what you might call the foreign policy and defence policy establishment in Canberra, I think there is a broad view that we have no choice but to do that. I think it would be a huge mistake for Australian political leaders or Australian public servants or Australian citizens for that matter, to just allow themselves to drift down the stream towards the idea that we always go to war when America goes to war, so we'll go to war this time around, because that completely fails to recognise that the idea of going to war with China over Taiwan is categorically different from any decision Australia has made strategically since 1939. Because a war between America and China would be the biggest war since the Second World War. And it would quite likely, I think, be a nuclear war. And so the idea that Australia would just, so to speak, out of habit, just because that's what we always do, take that course, I think would be a big mistake. And moreover, I just think it's kind of it's common position, but I think it's a mistaken and a kind of let me use a slightly colourful term, kind of morally cowardly position to just say, oh, well, of course we should go along, let's not think about it very much. So I think, in fact, the question as to whether or not we should support America in a war with China over Taiwan or anything else is a subordinate part of a broader, very important question. Is the best way for Australia to manage the extraordinary challenge posed to us by the emerging strategic rivalry between America and China to just pick America's side and say we're with them? Or should we do something a little bit more sophisticated and pull back and say, okay, this is a very complex situation. Where do we think it's heading? What outcome should we be looking for? What's the best solution? And touching on the point you made earlier, I think in Australia, the instinct is that the best outcome for us, the only outcome we can almost imagine, is one in which the Americans retain their primacy, that the old status quo is preserved, that China ends up going back to doing what it used to do, which is accepting America as the dominant power in East Asia. And I think that would be a nice outcome if we could make it happen, but I think it's so unlikely that it's hardly worth bothering about. And what we really need to be doing is thinking about supporting the emergence of a new order in Asia, which suits us as well as possible, but which acknowledges the reality of Chinese power. And if that's our approach, then the last thing we should be thinking of doing is going to war with China in order to try and preserve a status quo, which I think is past preserving, particularly because that war would be so dangerous. And all of that means that the idea of committing our future submarine capability to our willingness to support the United States in that kind of conflict is both really dumb strategically and a really dumb way of buying new submarines.
I think the point that you raised there, war would be catastrophic. Like we need to keep sort of reminding ourselves that it's almost sometimes becomes a trivial talking point, talking about war with China, but this is, really significant and serious business. And also, from my perspective, war is not inevitable. So we should be trying to avoid a sense in which conflict is an inevitable consequence of strategic competition, and talking much more about how a state like Australia can contribute to peace rather than whether or not we're going to win any war with China. But Sam, I'd like to get your thoughts on this issue.
Yeah, I was just going to go back to where you started with the question you posed to Hugh previously. I think you may very well be right that Australia's political class has more or less made its mind up on this question, and that we would back the United States. So in a sense, AUKUS changes nothing, I think is what you were kind of getting at. But it is different in the sense that I think Paul Keating was wrong when he referred to this capability, should it ever come to pass, should we ever acquire the full suite of 8 nuclear-powered submarines. He diminished that as being akin to throwing toothpicks at the mountain. I don't think that's right. 8 nuclear-powered submarines would be more than the French currently have, would be more than the United Kingdom currently has or plans to operate in the future. And on my calculations, if the United States plans on current projections to have around 66 nuclear-powered attack submarines by the middle of the century, if we have our full fleet by that point, we'd effectively be adding about 12% to that fleet. So that's a significant addition. In fact, strategically, it is much more significant and powerful a contribution that we would be contributing to potentially a US-led war against China than we can currently make right now. Even if we did everything that we are currently capable of doing, whether that's F-35s or Collins class or P-8 anti-submarine warfare aircraft or destroyers and so on. I think in the strategic punch that a fleet of 8 nuclear-powered submarines could deliver is far greater than anything we could offer right now. So this is a qualitative and quantitative shift.
I think that point is important because partly, the justification for nuclear powered submarines or any submarines is to create uncertainty. So if there is, 8 nuclear powered submarines out there, then that contributes to creating uncertainty in the minds of a potential adversary, I suppose. But I do want to get onto this issue of, whether or not they're actually ever going to happen. I mean, there are so many policy risks embedded in this proposal. As I said, there's 3 stages. Every stage really needs to go according to plan in order to work. The second stage, for example, needs to work. The Virginia class submarines need to be delivered in order to fill that capability gap that we were worried about. So this involves 3 governments over decades. What do you see? I might stick with you, Sam, for the minute. See as the major risks in derailing this plan?
The first thing I would say, and this is partly in response to Hugh's earlier statement, it's not yet clear to me that the 3 to 5 Virginia-class submarines that Australia plans to buy from the United States will not be backfilled. In fact, part of the AUKUS agreement that was announced in San Diego last week includes a major Australian investment in US shipyards. And it's really not clear at the moment what that will actually amount to, but I think it's at least possible that that will contribute to America's ability to actually to up the rate of submarine construction from, at the moment, I think something in the order of 1.6 new submarines per year to something closer to 3 submarines a year, which is what the Americans are aiming for. So it's possible that these submarines will be backfilled in the American fleet. Look, as a broader comment on the actual viability of the project, others have spoken more eloquently than me on the massive hurdles that we face and the massive challenge that we face. Again, to draw on Arthur Sinodinos, the outgoing Australian ambassador to the United States, he called it a moonshot, but he said it as a boast. I'm not sure it deserves to be a boast. It is as ambitious and I think for Australia as hubristic as that. I mean, I'm ambitious for Australia too. I want Australia to be a much bigger and more ambitious place. Defence policy, I would argue, is the wrong thing to be ambitious about. And look, we've been here twice before, right? So under the previous government, first of all, we reneged on a handshake agreement that we had with Japan to build Japanese submarines for the Royal Australian Navy. And then, of course, we cancelled a deal with France to build attack class submarines. So it won't shock me at all if this deal falls short or in future years collapses altogether.
Yeah, the track record over recent years hasn't exactly been stellar. But Hugh, I mean, in your view, what are the key risks in this proposal?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of them. But Beck, let me just go back, if I may, to pick up on a very important point that Sam made. That is, how much difference would a fleet of 8 nuclear-powered submarines make to the grand strategic balance if we end up getting them? I just like to register a slight disagreement with Sam on that. They'll make some difference. 8 submarines, if we're lucky, we might have 2 or 3 in the key operational areas at the time when the balloon goes up. And the key question is not, the question to ask yourself is, do they give us much better chance of winning? I mean, war's about winning or losing. And my reservation about this proposal is I don't actually think they make the difference between America winning and losing a war with China, nor do I think they make much difference between America being able to deter China and not. I don't think this capability significantly contributes to the military balance in Asia, either as a deterrent or as a war winner. The other point I'd make is that if we spent the same money on conventional submarines, and we'll probably come back to this question, then I think we'd actually get more warfighting capability and more deterrent capability out of a bigger fleet of conventional submarines than a smaller fleet of nuclears. On the risks, look, I think this is a very complex process to master an extremely difficult technology under very difficult circumstances. And one of the difficult circumstances we face, precisely because of those false starts that Sam mentioned, is that we're trying to preserve and maintain a submarine capability at a time when our old boats, the Collins boats, are getting perilously close to their end of their life. So the first big risk in this is one that we haven't even mentioned, and that is we have to keep the Collins submarines going until the new submarines arrive, because if we don't, we won't have any submariners that are able to drive these things. And submarine operation is extremely complicated. You have to maintain a cadre of skilled submariners in order to use the new boats if they arrive. We won't have a submarine capability if we have boats with no crews. And so doing that is going to be very difficult. Then there's a question as to whether or not the phase 2, that is the Virginia class boats, whether that will work. And there are 2 ways in which that might not work. The first is that we might not be ready when they come. We will not have Virginia class boats in service with the Royal Australian Navy in 2033, which is what the plan says, and unless the Navy and the rest of the country can master the skills required for what the government's calling nuclear stewardship, that is the capacity to actually manage this extraordinary, complex, and of course, inherently very dangerous technology. So you need very high levels of skills and disciplines and procedures and so on. Now, you might say 10 years ought to be long enough to do that, but I think we should be very cautious about presuming that we're going to get all of those skills in place in that time, particularly at a time when the Navy's got a huge number of other things to do. They've got to keep the Collins running. They're going to be introducing other classes of major warships and so on. So that looks like a short period. So it may well be that the boats turn up and we're not in a position to operate them. The second point is that it may well be the boats won't turn up. Because I think the chances of America changing its mind, the chances of future US administrations saying, what? We're giving 3 or 4 or 5 of our relatively small fleet for their tasks, relatively small fleet of nuclear attack submarines to Australia. Why are we doing that? And I mean, just on one sort of minor technical point, as Sam is right, we are going to be putting more money into the US shipbuilding industry. But my clear understanding is that is not going to build more Virginias. It's going to help the Americans keep the Virginias they've got in service. There will be no more boats. That was made very clear to us in some of the briefings last week. And so if you're a US congressperson, for example, and you're asked, if we don't have the Americans don't think they've got enough submarines as it is, and they're going to give some of them to Australia, I think the chances that even if they are confident that we'll go to war with them if they go to war with China, I think the chances of them thinking that it's better for America to pass those submarines to us than to keep them for themselves, That doesn't seem like a plausible argument to me. So I think that whole phase could fall over quite easily. And then, of course, there's the whole question of the AUKUS boats. The British have only just begun designing this new class of boat, which is a successor to their present Astute class boats. They're meant to start cutting steel by the end of this decade, to have building the boats by the end of this decade, to have their first one coming into service by the end of the next decade. That might seem like a very long time frame, but actually in the submarine business, that's very quick. That's extremely ambitious. And I think the chances of the British having trouble delivering the design and their first of class in that time frame is quite low. And then, of course, Australia has to start on this plan building our first AUKUS boats in Adelaide from scratch and delivering them by the early 2040s. That again is extremely ambitious. I think there is a very high likelihood, 80, 90% chance that that will slip a lot. And what that means is that our submarine capability over the next couple of decades doesn't go up, it goes down. Now, of course, any submarine project is complicated. There's no easy way to acquire submarines. But this one is a lot more complicated than others, and the chances of it going wrong are a lot more complicated. And a lot of those complexities arise from the fact that we are going for nuclear propulsion, which is an extremely exotic and demanding and risky technology.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And there is a lot to unpack. I mean, this has been billed as high risk, but potentially high reward. But there are just a lot of different ways in which the timeline could be disrupted, as well as the cost. And this bespoke tailoring of defence capabilities hasn't always gone well in Australia's history as well. One of the risks that I see thinking about maritime security as I do is the fear that I have that Australia will put all of its eggs in one submarine-shaped basket, but actually Australia has an enormous maritime domain, enormous jurisdiction, 8 million square kilometres exclusive economic zone. We tend to think in terms of territorial defence, but actually the maritime security is incredibly important for Australia's national security, and there are often non-traditional security challenges that are going to be, very important for Australia's security. And submarines won't necessarily help out with things like rising sea levels or pandemics, preventing shipping and these sorts of issues as well. So, I mean, for me, that's a kind of a separate set of concerns about investing so much into one capability that has, it can do a lot of things, like surveillance and, creating uncertainty in the minds of adversaries, but there's a lot of things that it can't do. And we should also be thinking more in terms of things like diplomacy and development for Australia's defence and security as well. But to turn that into a question, it's really this cost business. I mean, $368 billion. I think one of the differences between you, Sam, and Hugh is that, Hugh, you're quite candid about the fact that if we wanted to take a more independent path from the United States, it is going to cost Australia. Whereas, Sam, you don't think that it would necessarily cost Australia so much to do that. So I might start with you, Sam. I mean, there is that issue of the cost of the nuclear-powered submarines, but there is also that broader issue of how much does it cost to defend Australia?
Yeah, look, the $268 to $368 billion figure was, I realise, eye-watering for most people. I got a little bit of sticker shock myself. But of course, it is over 30 years, and the projections I've seen suggest that it would add about 0.15% of GDP to our current defence spending. So it's affordable for Australia. It's merely a case of, is it the right thing to do, and especially compared to what else we could be spending the money on. So it's always about opportunity cost. Look, Yes, I don't think it's necessary at the moment for Australia to be spending a whole lot more on defence, and I base that not on any kind of woolly-minded or optimistic view about China. I mean, I've had a few goes at Keating already, but I am mystified by the fact that he can be so dismissive of China's rise as a military power, because it is, truly astonishing the rate at which China's air and maritime forces in particular have grown in capability over the last 30 years. And it's absolutely right that Australia should respond to that. The question we're debating is really how we respond and whether AUKUS and associated initiatives are the right way to respond. I absolutely think they're not. In fact, I think one of the strange weaknesses of Australia's defence debate in recent times, given that it is so centred on China, is how little expertise there is in that public debate about the PLA, the People's Liberation Army of China, and exactly what it can do to Australia. So that should be our starting point. If we're worried about China, if we're proposing to transform the entire defence force because of China, we ought to have a pretty good idea about what China is actually capable of doing to us. And I spend a chapter in the forthcoming book, The Echidna Strategy, on that exact question. And when you do examine it soberly and closely, and I've been both in the government, in the intelligence world, and now in the think tank world, I've been following and watching the growth of the PLA for most of my career. And despite its impressive rise, it is still a very limited force in terms of power projection, and there isn't a great deal that it can do to damage, to do harm to Australia, because we are so far away. And as I said, Australia's single biggest defence asset is distance. So as impressive as China's military buildup has been, it hasn't overcome that tyranny of distance. If you want to send a 500-kilogram warhead over the next hill, you can use a few soldiers to do that job. If you want to send it over 500 meters away, you use mortar. If you want to send it 5,000 meters away, you use an artillery piece. If you want to send it 5,000 kilometers away, you have to use an intercontinental ballistic missile. At every stage, it gets more expensive. And yet at every stage, the military effect you achieve is exactly the same. It remains constant. So projecting military force over vast distances is incredibly expensive and technically difficult. And China's never going to overcome that, even though it will continue to expand its military capabilities. So to me, the key for Australia is to actually exploit that distance and not try to overcome it, as I said earlier. And so what it leads me to is a conclusion that I guess subtly this might be a slight affront to Hugh and the work he's done over his long career on Australian defence, but I actually think defending Australia is quite a bit easier than we think it is. There's an industry devoted to making it look much more difficult than it is, but I don't think it's that difficult, and it consists in making sure that China can't overcome that distance problem. It seems to me there are only three things that can really seriously damage Australia's security from military threats, and I'll list them very briefly in order of seriousness from lowest to highest. First is if China develops several military bases in our immediate neighbourhood, and I stress several, one wouldn't be enough. Second is if Indonesia becomes our enemy, because Indonesia already has overcome that tyranny of distance. It's very close to us. And the third one that Hugh has already mentioned, if there's a nuclear war between the US and China. Other than that, there's not an awful lot that can go wrong for Australia in security terms. We won the lottery in strategic geography terms, and therefore defending Australia ought not to cost very much.
Well, Hugh, I will pass it over to you for right of reply.
Well, look, the first thing to say is, I think the core argument that Sam is making there is absolutely right. And it's a very important argument, because forever, really, in Australian history, we've been seized by this conviction that Australia cannot defend itself. that we must rely on our allies, our great and powerful friends, first Britain and then America, because we can't defend ourselves independently. And just going back to what we were talking about before, one of the reasons why it's so easy for Australians to slip into thinking that, of course, we'd have to go to war with America against China if the balloon goes up, is that we'd have to do that because we have to keep America as an ally, because we can't defend ourselves by ourselves. And I think that is profoundly wrong. So that's the first point. The second point is that I think it's terrifically important the way in which Sam has established in his work, and I haven't read it, but I'm sure in the forthcoming book, which I think is going to be a very important contribution to the debate, that sense of distance as an asset to be exploited. And I absolutely agree with him that if we exploit that distance properly, then we can defend ourselves much more easily than people often think. I think the difference between Sam and me, and you can summarize this really in 1% of GDP, I think, Sam, correct me if I'm wrong, I think he thinks that something like the present 2% of GDP will be enough. In my work on this, I've come to a back of the envelope calculation that's going to look more like 3% of GDP. And the reason for the difference between us is very simple. That is, I look, when I came to my 3% number, I involved me projecting forward where China's future capability could go over the 2 or 3 decades it will take us to build our capability. Because you can never, it's a little bit like shooting clay pigeons. You can't aim your defence policy at the capabilities a potential adversary has now. You have to aim your capabilities at the capabilities a potential adversary will have when your new capabilities come online, which is 20, 30 years away. And so I think, and I might be being too pessimistic, but my number is higher than Sam's because I'm building basically a bigger force, because I'm thinking of a bigger Chinese capability in 20 or 30 years from now. And that's based on perhaps a rather too simplistic, more or less straight line trajectory of where they've come in the last 25 years, which, as Sam said, is pretty remarkable. If they keep doing the same thing for the next 25 years, then I think we'll need a bit more to ensure our security than he mentioned. The other point I'd make is, of course, very much he's right. We have to focus on Indonesia, and we also don't want to forget about India. We're going to live in a region which has 2 or 3 great powers, China, India, and potentially Indonesia. And all of those have to be part of our thinking about our future posture.
I would like to get back to Indonesia and India in a little bit, but while we're on China, I mean, Sam, the point that you make about Australia's knowledge on China is a really important one. There was a report last week from the Australian Academy of the Humanities that pointed out that that's in decline, and that Australia's knowledge, its capability in understanding China is a consequence of that. But we do have a lot of questions from the audience asking for comment about exaggeration of the China threat by media and politicians, of course. Last week, we also saw a lot of commentary around the Red Alert series in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. And there seems, to be this intensification of articulating China as being a direct threat to Australia, potentially a direct threat to Australia within 3 years, according to that report. So on the issue of China, I mean, there seems to me to be some cognitive dissonance in some of how we think about China in terms of strengths and weaknesses. I mean, there's 2 versions of China. There's the one that's the unstoppable force that, in 25 years' time will have, significantly expanded its military and its power, and that this poses imminent risks to Australia. But then there's this other vision of China that sits alongside that it's on the brink of economic collapse, or that its demographic profile means that this is likely to present challenges to China's future rise. I mean, there seems to be these 2 visions are unhelpful in really thinking about Australia's relationship with China, but also thinking about the kinds of threats that China poses directly to Australia's defence interests. So to turn that into a question, and Sam, I might direct this to you, how should Australia be thinking about China and its relationship with China?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right to point to that juxtaposition about China's, on the one hand, China's enormous strength, but also from the same group of commentators, sometimes you will hear them talk about its demographic decline, etc. There's a juxtaposition on our side as well that tends to come from the right, which is a triumphalism about our Western liberal democracies that's coupled with a constant fear of that Western civilization is this far from collapse. That's an odd juxtaposition too. How should we think about China? Well, I think I'd start by saying that, yes, we do need to be realistic about China's ambitions. And I do think we need to be, frankly, pessimistic about those in terms of Australia's interests. China, as I think Hugh said in his own words at the beginning, no country of that size is going to be indefinitely satisfied with a subordinate strategic stature in its own region. So we should expect that China will want to be the leading strategic power in Asia, and that means displacing the United States for that status. And then ultimately, China's ambitions will be to become the dominant strategic power in Asia. Now, I tend to think that it's not within our power to stop the first thing from happening. China will be the leading strategic power and certain consequences follow from that. It is absolutely within our power to stop China becoming the dominant strategic power in Asia. And one of the reasons I'm optimistic on that point is because we are operating in a maritime environment. And when we're talking about China's ambitions to be that great power in our part of the world, China does have to have a decisive maritime advantage in order to achieve those ambitions. The good news for us is that in the maritime realm, the defensive side, the side that wants to essentially nullify China's power, has an enormous advantage. By some expert views, it's something like 50-1 in terms of costs to deny China maritime supremacy versus what it would cost for China to gain maritime supremacy. And that's also why I think Australia's spending doesn't necessarily have to go up. It's simply because the job of denying China maritime supremacy is so much more affordable and technologically so much more achievable than what I assume will be China's ultimate ambition to be the dominant maritime power. There is one wrinkle in that judgment that I would offer, which is that when China looks at a map of the region, I think it sees on its periphery other great powers that are going to constrain its ambitions. So in the Indian Ocean and in South Asia, it's going to be India. In Central Asia, it's going to be, to some extent, maybe less so because of recent events, Russia. In Northeast Asia, it's going to be Japan and the United States for the foreseeable future. Southeast Asia is exceptional in that regard because it doesn't have a resident great power. And so if China does have a more achievable outlet for its ambitions to dominate Asia, it is in our part of the world, that is in Southeast Asia and potentially the Pacific. And so I think it ought to be Australia's ambition to effectively encourage the creation of a resident great power in this part of the world, and that can only be Indonesia.
I am very interested in that argument, and it's one that you raise in your book, Sam, about the role of Indonesia in Australia's strategic future, and the idea that perhaps Australia needs to be pursuing a formal strategic alliance with Indonesia. The part, though, where this loses me a little bit is, because that sits alongside this idea of loosening the ties with the United States at the same time. And it seems to me that that pursuing a formal alliance with Indonesia may be less plausible than just maintaining the alliance with the United States, and perhaps even less in Australia's interests. So I wanted to ask you a bit more, and I'll get to you, Hugh, as well. But just while Sam mentioned the Indonesia question, I mean, there's geographic alignment. Like, yes, they're close, but there's a lot of sort of tumultuous history between Australia and Indonesia, including confrontasi in the 1960s, including, the very real disagreement that Australia and Indonesia had over East Timor in 1999, which actually led to that security treaty that was signed in 1995 being disbanded. So there's also trust deficit issues, I think, between Australia and Indonesia. There's knowledge capability gaps as well that would need to be overcome. But I think the thing that I think about the most is whether or not Indonesia would want a strategic defence alignment with Australia, given that, just like us, Indonesia looks north as well. So I just wondered whether you could comment on some of the potential challenges in building a stronger relationship with Indonesia, and whether or not Indonesia, being the great power in the region, would actually be seen in Canberra as being good for Australia's interests.
Thank you, and I'll keep it short because Hugh deserves to get another word in. The first thing I'd say is that I don't think a much closer relationship with Indonesia does imply the need to loosen our connections with the United States at all. I think what I would say, though, is that we don't need to always take the first step to further tighten that relationship. And, nobody asked us to do AUKUS. It wasn't the United States behind the scenes, niggling us to say, really, you guys need to buy nuclear-powered submarines. No, this was our initiative. And of course, the Americans leapt at it. Why wouldn't they? This is going to be a massive payday for the American shipbuilding industry. And it further ties Australia to American strategic objectives in the region. But they never asked us to do it. So I'm not at all calling for a loosening of Australia's relationship with the alliance with the United States, but let's stop preemptively tying ourselves even more tightly than the United States itself demands. If the alliance does degrade in years to come, it will not be because Australia leaves the US, it'll be because the US leaves us. And that's part of a tradition of great powers leaving Australia behind as their own ambitions change. On the Indonesia question, everything you've said is correct. There are countless reasons to be sceptical about the idea of Australia ever forming an alliance-like arrangement with Indonesia. The only argument that's on my side, and the only one I really try to present in the book, is that when strategic motivation and strategic circumstances demand it, then an awful lot of problems can be overcome in a very short time. Germany, after all, Russia invaded Ukraine on a Thursday. On the following Sunday, the German Chancellor gave a speech which essentially overturned 3 decades of German foreign and defence policy. So when circumstances change, governments can change their minds very, very quickly. And it seems to me, although I don't expect it to happen that fast in Indonesia, that eventually circumstances will assert themselves to the point where Indonesia decides that, yes, we do have to develop some kind of counterweight to China. That doesn't mean becoming more Western aligned. And in fact, Australia should be absolutely clear that Indonesia doesn't need to align itself with the West. But it does mean that Australia and Indonesia need to have one core objective at the centre of a joint, a strategic partnership, and that is that together they can stop China from dominating maritime Southeast Asia.
Interesting. And Hugh, I will bring you in now. I mean, there's sort of three different parts to the conversation that I might get your view in. First is that question about how do we think about China? And then, I mean, you've also written about the importance of Indonesia as well. But there's also this question of whether or not the United States will abandon Australia down the line. That seems to be the concern here, that when great powers change, when their circumstances change, then they may drop their junior allies. But I mean, from what I see, the trend at the moment anyway, not to say that this will necessarily continue, but the trend is Washington is taking Australia more and more seriously. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, okay, very big questions. Let me just go back to the point about how we should think about China. As usual, Paul Keating last week was perhaps excessively colourful and forthright in his language, but I do think on this point, as on others, he made some important points. China's growing power and its ambitions to become the dominant power, at least in East Asia and the Western Pacific, does threaten the foundations of the Asian order on which we have always regarded ourselves as depending. China wants to push the United States out of East Asia. And that's something that we in Australia viscerally respond against, because we've always regarded the domination of our region by a friendly Anglo-Saxon power as a necessary and sufficient condition for our security. And it's very unsettling for us to imagine living in an Asia which is no longer dominated and made safe for us by our Anglo-Saxon mates. But there's a difference between saying that and saying that China threatens Australia directly. I don't think it does. Nothing in China's policy or their objectives, as far as we can see it and so on, suggests to me that the China of today has any intention or motive, or going back to the point Sam was making before, very much capability to threaten Australia directly. But there is a question about what kind of China we'll deal with in 30 years' time. And remember, the decisions we make about the capabilities we buy are decisions about the wars we can fight 30 years from now. What's happening today is irrelevant. We have to frame our capability decisions today around the strategic liabilities of three decades hence. And I think it's at least prudent for Australia to recognise that over the decades between now and 2050, China could both become much more powerful country within our region and could develop policies which became more threatening to Australia. It would become less unlikely that China would make a direct challenge to Australia now, 30 years from now, than it is today. And if we want to be in a position to resist that, then we have to make big decisions now. And my argument in How to Defend Australia book was that I think we do need to, position ourselves for that kind of future. I'll just make another point in response to something Sam says. I don't think there's any chance that China ends up dominating Asia writ large. I think the most that China can end up doing is dominating East Asia and the Western Pacific, because whatever happens, it can't dominate South Asia and the Indian Ocean. That's India's. And so, I do think that that's going to be India's sphere of influence. To a certain extent, it is already. I think China's chances of dominating East Asia and the Western Pacific, however, are quite high. And that's partly because I do discount the long-term future of American power in this part of the world. So let me just jump to that question. Look, the reason why I am pessimistic about the future of our alliance with the United States, because I'm pessimistic about the future of America's strategic commitment to its position in the Western Pacific. America has been the dominant power in the Western Pacific, roughly speaking, since 1890, or the maritime power in the Western Pacific since 1899, when it defeated the Spanish in Manila Bay. And it's tempting to think that the world's always been like that. But actually, in the long patterns of history, 123 years is not very long. All good things come to an end. And America today faces in China by far and away the most formidable rival it's ever faced anywhere, because China has an economy bigger than America's already. And I think the costs and risks to the United States of preserving its position in Asia in the face of very determined opposition from a country as powerful as China is today, and in a situation where China holds all the advantages of being the local power, distance being so important for all the reasons Sam spelled out before, I think the chance of America being willing to bear the costs and risks of doing that in the face of China's challenge in the longer term are low. Now, the irony, as you said, the peculiar thing is America seems to be talking up its enthusiasm for preserving its position in Asia. The whole sort of the rhetoric comes out of Washington and all the rest of it. But what strikes me is that rhetoric's all there is to it. The United States has done nothing like enough in the 5 years since it sort of formally declared China to be a strategic rival to really strengthen its position in East Asia, to push back hard. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about AUKUS is that along with the Quad, it's all they've done. It's all they've got. If you compare what America did in the first 5 years of the first Cold War, the Cold War against the Soviet Union, compared to what it's done in the first 5 years since 2017, since it launched its second Cold War against China, in those first 5 years, it completely transformed itself and transformed its global posture to produce the Cold War posture of the United States, which ended up winning the Cold War. Nothing like that has happened. I don't think America's really got the spirit for this fight, and I think that the historians of future will look back at what's happening right now and see that what we're actually seeing is America withdrawing from Asia. They're not doing enough to push back against the Chinese to make a real difference, and for that reason, I think we're going to end up in a region in which America withdraws from Asia, no longer sees itself having vital strategic interests that need to be defended in this part of the world. And of course, Australia's alliance with America has always been, from America's point of view, primarily about supporting America's position in East Asia. If it's no longer trying to do that, it no longer needs an alliance with Australia. And it's always worth remembering that despite the rhetoric our political leaders use, sentiment, shared history, value, culture, and traditions don't make any difference at all to whether alliances really work. What matters is whether the interests converge. Now, lastly, on Indonesia, I'm sorry, these are three very big subjects we're traversing here. Look, I absolutely buy the argument, and I've argued myself, that it's quite likely that Indonesia will be our most important strategic asset in the decades ahead, precisely because, for the reasons of geography that Sam spelled out, it is the country in Asia, the large country in Asia, with which we have the most natural alignment of strategic interests and objectives. Japan, for example, with whom we've put a lot of diplomatic effort into building up a relationship in recent years. It doesn't, Japan's security doesn't really depend on Australia's security, and Australia's security doesn't really depend on Japan's security. Where the geography alone tells you that there's not much convergence there, whereas Australia and Indonesia, because we're close, that interdependence, that convergence of interests is very real. That's the good news. The bad news is that Indonesia is also a potential threat to Australia. It has the potential to threaten Australia if things go bad, precisely because it's so close. And so, Indonesia is a potential ally because it's close. And it's a potential threat because it's close. And as Indonesia becomes, as I think it probably will, in its own way, a great power, it will have the fourth biggest economy in the world well before the middle of the century, which is very hard for Australians to get our heads around, then Indonesia is going to take on the characteristics both of a very significant strategic asset and a potentially very dangerous strategic rival. And it's going to be our responsibility to manage that. So my last point is simply this, that if we want Indonesia to be a strategic asset, we in Australia are going to have to work very hard to make it so. And whereas in the past we have tended to assume that we can set the terms of the relationship with Indonesia because we're a rich, strong country, and they're big and close, but poor and weak. But now they're going to be big and close and rich and strong. And we're going to be in a position we've never been in before. Australia has always taken for granted the fact that we're the strongest country in our immediate neighbourhood. And that's just not going to be true anymore, particularly if Indonesia starts developing air and maritime capabilities. One of the strange things about Indonesia is it is the most maritime country in the world, world's biggest archipelago and all the rest of it. and yet it has an almost trivial air and naval capability. If down the track, as it must if it's going to take itself seriously as a strategic player in Asia over the decades to come, it starts building serious air and maritime capabilities, then it's going to be both a more significant potential asset and a more potential significant threat. What that means to us is that we can no longer afford to assume that we can set the terms of the relationship, and that is going to require Australia to make what I suspect will be some very uncomfortable compromises on issues that we think we hold dear. Relations with Indonesia are going to be a very challenging part of this future strategic picture.
Well, we have a couple of, well, more than a couple actually, quite a number of excellent questions in the Q&A. We only have 10 minutes left. So what I thought I might do is ask a couple of those questions and then go to Sam and then Hugh, and you can respond to which parts of the questions you would like to. But the first one is, given the state of US politics and the UK's present economic situation, are both nations likely to even remain reliable partners for Australia in the coming years? I mean, I think we've talked a bit about the US, but the UK is interesting in this whole AUKUS picture. So it'd be good to get your sense of the UK's role here. The second, if Australia invests excessively in submarines, surely an adversary would target Australia using capables that are less susceptible to submarines. And I would like to sort of add this question on about whether or not, and it has sort of been touched on during the discussion, but whether or not this all creates an environment where Australia is more at risk of being attacked because it is growing its capabilities in this particular way. And finally, I know I'm asking a lot of you, but about the question of crewing. I mean, this one is essential in terms of policy risks. The fact that, these submarines need to be crewed, these boats need to be staffed, and that is already a challenge for the ADF. How is the Navy going to have the ability to expand as an organisation to fill what will be highly technical roles? So, Sam, I might start with your thoughts on some of those issues.
Thank you. I'll go as quickly as I can. Just on US politics and whether the US will be a reliable partner going forward. I think over the long term, the recent instability in American politics actually doesn't matter all that much. I mean, I essentially buy Hugh's argument about American resolve in Asia. In fact, I've borrowed liberally from his argument for my own book. We part ways on a few specific points, but I overwhelmingly agree that American resolve is declining because, the challenge is so great and America's motives are not that strong. America's inherently a very secure country. It doesn't need to stage this contest against China, what would be the biggest contest of its kind in American history. But it is worth noting, actually, just briefly, that as I understand it, the first official contact between Australia and the US, which was an Australian mission to Washington to propose the AUKUS initiative, happened in May of 2021. At that point, the paint would barely have been dry on the repairs to the US Capitol after the January 6 riots. Mm-hmm. And it is frankly astonishing to me that those events and the Trump presidency as a whole had so little impact on the decision makers at the time that just a few months after that, epochal event in the at the US Capitol, we came to them with a proposal to double down on the alliance. I find that a startling small fact. On whether Australia is at more risk, well, I would add to the AUKUS decision the fact that we are now going to effectively base American submarines on our west coast. We call it a rotation, but I think it'll be similar to basing. Also, we heard last year that the facilities at the Tyndall Air Base in Australia's north are going to be expanded to allow operational basing of American bombers. When you add all that up together, yes, unambiguously, I think that increases the risk of military threats to Australia. Chinese military targeters are going to be looking at Australian facilities much more than they would have in the past. On the crewing question, look, one of the real oddities of the AUKUS announcement in San Diego last week was that Prime Minister Albanese focused so much on job creation out of this. We are a 3.5% unemployment economy. We are not an economy, a nation that's in desperate need of, government job creation schemes. So it is odd to me that that is the justification for this. And I think just reinforces the point that so long as the economy remains strong, and I think there's a good chance of that happening given our excellent record over the last 30 years, the prospects of actually finding the people to maintain and to crew these submarines is going to overwhelm us.
Hugh, your thoughts on those issues?
Okay, very briefly. Look, I absolutely agree with everything Sam said about the US. For all the peculiarities of traumas of US politics over the last few years and going forward, I think the underlying trends are really more important. And really, the isolationism of the sort of MAGA Trump side of American politics is matched in some ways by a different kind and differently expressed isolationism, trend towards isolationism on the Democrat side of US politics. Look, as for the UK, I'm just going to be very blunt here. The UK is just in this for the jobs. You know, the United Kingdom does not have a serious strategic role to play in East Asia in the decades ahead. In fact, Britain has not played a serious strategic role in the Western Pacific since they withdrew the primary fleet units from the Western Pacific in 1904 to meet the rising challenge from Germany. And then that's not going to change. So I think I really just dismiss there being any serious strategic element to the British interest in East Asia or in AUKUS, notwithstanding the rhetoric. And look, just on the crewing point, of course, crewing these submarines will be very demanding, and finding crews will be demanding because submarine service is, to put it mildly, not for everyone. But I do think, and this really touches on the point that Sam made, that that's really just a lesser included case of the much bigger question about how Australia manages the introduction of this extraordinarily complex capability. I mean, whatever happens, managing and crewing our future submarine capability was going to be very demanding. But by deciding to go for nuclear boats, that very demanding challenge has suddenly been made literally 10 times bigger. This and I think that the question is not so much will we find the crews, but will we find the whole national workforce required to undertake this enterprise, particularly at a time when, as Sam says, we are short of workers. And the fact is, our economy will suffer because workers who would have been employed in more productive activities, in capital generation, are going to be involved in building defence capability, spending more money, more complexity, and more complex, difficult defence capabilities, which I don't think, just to get back to the basic point, I don't think nuclear-powered submarines are more cost-effective for Australia than conventional ones. We don't need to pay that cost.
I think we have time for one last audience question before we need to wrap it up, if we keep it brief. But this is a question about Paul Keating's comments. Would it be fair to assume that all the members on this panel wholeheartedly reject the comments of Keating that China would fall over themselves to have a proper relationship with Australia? I'm pretty dubious about that suggestion. But Sam, how about you?
I missed that comment. I'm not quite sure what he means. Is it that China, if Australia stopped provoking China, then they would fall over themselves to re-establish strong diplomatic relations with Australia? Well, I actually think the recent past, is pretty strong evidence that that's not the case. I mean, it was China's taken some pretty strong economic action against Australia. I shouldn't actually say pretty strong, because Australia's withstood that economic pressure very, very well. It's one of the great triumphs, and in fact, I think, of Australian foreign policy in recent years, that with a strong economy, we've managed to withstand economic coercion from China. And it's a lesson that we've refused to learn on our defence policy. When China introduced trade measures and tariffs and so on against Australia, nobody in their right mind, nobody in the Australian debate said or offered the idea that, you know what Australia should do is to retaliate with our own trade measures. And yet we never took that lesson to heart for our defence policy. We've decided on a defence policy which is all about retaliation and about projecting power against China, when really what we should be about is absorb the ability to absorb pressure, which has worked so well on the economic side.
It's an interesting comparison. I hadn't thought of it like that. Hugh, your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think Sam's really aced it there. I think that's precisely right. Look, I don't think China's bending over itself to get on well with Australia. Australia is a significant partner for China in various ways, but if Paul did indeed say that, I must say, like Sam, I didn't hear him say that, but if he did indeed say that, I think that's, as is sometimes the case with Paul, something of an overstatement. But I think there is, as always with Paul, an important germ there, and that is that this is a relationship to be managed. To so to speak, preemptively declare China as a bitter enemy, which is what we have seen coming out of some parts of the Australian debate, is wrong. China's not going to do us any favours, but if we play our cards right, we can be a significant partner to China, and that means we do have some influence over China in how the relationship goes forward. We can't set the terms of the relationship, but we can certainly, if we effective middle power diplomacy, can shape the way things go. And I don't think we should be so as pessimistic about it as many contributors to this debate seem to be.
I think that's a good way of putting it. There is a kind of middle ground here where it takes two to tango with diplomatic relationships, exactly. And the blame shouldn't all lie on one side or the other. But I'm afraid that's all we have time for this evening. It's been, I'm sure our audience agrees, it's been a really enlightening discussion. I've learned a great deal. So I would like to thank Hugh and Sam for joining me this evening. And I would like to thank Rob Mann for his expert curation of Ideas in Society. 14 years going strong. Thank you, Rob. And thanks again for inviting me to be a part of one of these events. I would also like to thank Tori Dillon and her team at Trobe University Events. They do an excellent job behind the scenes, making sure that we look good on the screen. So thank you. And of course, I'd like to thank you, our audience members. It's always great to be able to present these events, and I hope that you enjoyed the discussion as much as what I did. I would like to point you in the direction of the Ideas in Society mailing list, which will provide more information about events that are coming up in the future. So once again, thank you all.